By the end of the 1980s, the image of the American highway tractor had already taken shape. A long hood, plenty of chrome, a boxy cab, and a huge sleeper behind the driver. Today, trucks like these are called classics. Back then, they were simply a familiar sight on American roads. Ford had a strong position in heavy vocational trucks, dump trucks, and construction chassis. But in the most prestigious segment, long-haul highway tractors, the company clearly lagged behind the main players. With the new era of fuel economy and aerodynamics, Ford had a chance to change that. Traditional trucks were fitting less and less comfortably into the new requirements, and Ford had an opportunity, if not to become the leader, then at least to move much closer to the top. That was exactly what the Ford Aeromax was built for. But did the plan work? Let's find out. It would be nice to say that the Ford Aeromax was first and revolutionary, but it wasn't. Ford's truck division had clearly slept through the new aerodynamic revolution. The irony was that, at the same time, Ford's passenger cars were among the first to embrace rounded, aerodynamic shapes. In the mid-1980s, Ford was still betting on the classic long hood L TL9000, but the Kenworth T600, introduced in 1985, seriously changed the rules of the game in the highway tractor market and forced other manufacturers to urgently rethink their plans. After the 1973 fuel crisis, many people in the trucking industry understood one thing very clearly. Fuel efficiency was becoming a priority, and every possible method had to be used to improve it. There were two main directions: engines and aerodynamics. But since most American truck makers used engines supplied by outside manufacturers, aerodynamics became the most obvious area that still depended directly on the company building the cab and chassis. When Kenworth engineers began testing their models in a wind tunnel, they quickly discovered an unpleasant fact. At highway speeds, the classic Kenworth W900 used about a third of its power just to push through the air. Before that, the company had paid little attention to aerodynamic performance. Kenworth's engineers also had limited experience in this field, which is why more than 7 years passed between the start of the project and the arrival of the production T600. At first, the T600's appearance was met with skepticism and open mockery. Because of its distinctive hood shape, the truck even received the nickname Ant-Eater, since many people thought its front end looked like the nose of that animal. But the joke stopped quickly when it became clear that the sloped hood and integrated fenders could deliver around 20% better fuel economy. On top of that, on highways and under full load, the T600's better aerodynamics meant it could do the same job with an engine roughly 100 horsepower less powerful than a comparable conventional truck. Another important point was that this result was achieved without dramatically increasing the cost of each truck. The result was convincing enough that, after the T600, ignoring the new direction in highway tractors meant voluntarily staying on the sidelines of the business. Of course, Ford was watching Kenworth's success closely. In 1988, the company introduced the Aeromax L9000, Ford's first serious aerodynamic answer to the new reality of the highway tractor market. It was not a completely new platform, but a deep reworking of the existing L series. The name of this line was tied to the plant in Louisville, Kentucky, where these trucks were built. That is why the trucks themselves were often called the Louisville line. Regular Ford L-Series trucks were the working backbone of the company's truck division. This platform was used for dump trucks, construction chassis, specialized vehicles, regional trucks, and heavy tractors. But the Aeromax L9000 went much further in terms of aerodynamics. Ford took an existing heavy-duty base and changed its exterior. A more streamlined front end, integrated fenders, new headlights, aerodynamic elements around the fuel tanks, and a special Aero Bullet sleeper. The Aeromax L9000 was marketed primarily through fuel savings. In a 1988 sales brochure, Ford directly called it the most fuel-efficient heavy conventional tractor the company had ever built, and cited a result of 7.88 miles per gallon in an SAE Type 2 test. In other words, Ford was trying to show carriers, we also have a modern aerodynamic tractor, and this is not just a new, better-looking front end, but real savings on the highway. But despite all its strengths, the Aeromax L9000 still was not the kind of truck that could be called the true flagship of the brand. Ford needed a big, impressive, high-status highway tractor, one that would keep the familiar American look, but also bring the advantages of the new aerodynamic school. That is how Ford brought the Aeromax 120 to market, a 1992 model, and the company's big hope in the fight for the prestigious highway tractor segment. The Aeromax 120 was based on a modified Ford L9000 platform. To improve maneuverability and axle weight distribution, the engineers used a setback front axle layout. In simple terms, Ford was following the same basic path as Kenworth with the T600. The front axle was moved closer to the rear tandem, which helped make a large highway tractor easier to handle. Unlike some other trucks in the L series, the Aeromax 120 did not rely on Ford engines. As was common in the American heavy truck market, buyers were offered diesel engines from outside suppliers: Cummins, Caterpillar, and Detroit Diesel. They were paired with the traditional manual Eaton transmissions used in trucks of this class. But of course, the main feature of the Ford Aeromax 120 was its appearance. The truck looked as if it had spent many hours in a wind tunnel, and in fact, it had. The front end was developed with the help of computer modeling, after which specialists built a scale model and tested it in a wind tunnel. As a result, compared with the regular Ford L9000, the Aeromax 120 received a much more streamlined body and, according to Ford's advertising, was supposed to use less fuel. The front hood assembly was made of fiberglass and tilted forward as one piece, giving access to the engine. The fuel tanks and the batteries, which had been moved closer to them, were hidden behind aerodynamic fiberglass fairings. Overall, if we judge it purely by design, I would risk saying that the Ford Aeromax 120 looked much better than the Anteater, although that is, of course, a matter of taste. Buyers greeted Ford's new flagship with interest, but no revolution followed. Ford did not publish exact sales figures for the Aeromax 120 specifically. Still, for the Aeromax line as a whole, it is known that the company was satisfied with the early results and expected to strengthen its position in the heavy truck segment. The biggest bet was placed on the Aeromax 120 itself, as the flagship and the main hope of the truck division. Unfortunately, those hopes were not fully realized. The Aeromax 120 was a modern, impressive, and technically convincing truck, but it arrived too late to claim the glory of the aerodynamic breakthrough. The main symbol of the new era already belonged to Kenworth, and other manufacturers had also prepared their own answers. So the Ford Aeromax 120 was not a failure as a truck, but it could not change Ford's position in the highway tractor segment. For Ford's entire truck division, the situation was getting worse. In 1996, the company held only 9% of the American heavy truck market, and that share was still falling. For comparison, the market leader, Freightliner, held 29.4%. In the end, it was Freightliner that reached a deal to buy part of Ford's truck business. The deal included Ford's medium and heavy-duty Class 6 through 8 truck lines, including Louisville, Aeromax, and Cargo, along with the tooling, documentation, and rights needed to continue production. In other words, Freightliner did not buy all of Ford's truck operations. It bought the part responsible for larger commercial trucks. For Freightliner, the purchase also made sense. The company was very strong in highway tractors, but wanted to expand its presence in vocational and professional segments. Instead of creating that lineup from scratch, Freightliner received ready-made models, a production base, and Ford's customer network. There was one important catch. The deal did not include the right to keep using the Ford name or logo, so the former Ford trucks had to be sold under a different name. Freightliner found a fairly original solution. It revived the Sterling brand for these machines. Sterling was not a newly invented name. It had been an old American truck brand from the early 20th century, known in narrow circles connected with trucking. But this was not a continuation of the old Sterling company. It was the revival of a long unused name. It sounded like a truck brand, carried a bit of history, and helped separate the former Ford models from Freightliner's main lineup. Along with vocational chassis and dump trucks, the new owner also kept the highway tractors. The regular Louisville line became the Sterling L line, while the aerodynamic Aeromax line became the basis for the Sterling A line. After that, however, the story of Ford's troubled truck line almost repeated itself. The former Ford models sold under the Sterling brand did well enough for the brand to survive for more than a decade, but not well enough to meet Daimler's expectations. Sterling found its niche in vocational and professional trucks, but remained a secondary brand inside the company, clearly weaker than Freightliner and with too much overlap in the model lineup. In 2008, Daimler openly explained Sterling's closure by saying that the brand had not reached the market penetration it needed. According to Fleet Equipment, despite modernization and the launch of new models, Sterling reached only about a quarter of Freightliner's market penetration. So in 2009, the brand was shut down, and the remaining segments were divided between Freightliner and Western Star. That was the final end of the Louisville line and its aerodynamic successor. The main question in this whole story is something else. If Ford's truck division had not lagged behind its passenger car colleagues, if it had started working on aerodynamics earlier, and if it had launched a truck like this before Kenworth, could Ford have become one of the major names in the American highway tractor segment? We can only guess, because now we will never know the answer.